Thank you, Sohani. I can only disappoint after that, but thank you so much, and thank you for bringing together this group. Thanks to Kate and others as well for the space, and I think, Sohani, really more power to you. I think I've just been so impressed seeing everything you've been doing since I first heard about you from Erica when you were an undergraduate at Duke. So what I wanted to do today was really build on themes that Sohani had asked me to, but in a slightly, in some ways, hopefully broader and narrower sense. I want to more broadly lay out, I think, some of the issues we want to think about when we think about bridging this gap between what women want and what the economy is able to provide them. But it's going to be narrower in that I'm going to largely talk about the context of India, since that's really where most of my work is focused. But I also think that India is an interesting context to look at. It's a very fast-growing, lower middle-income economy. It has, on some aspects like education, done incredibly well at supporting women. But we don't see this translating yet into the labor market. And it's also worth remembering that one reason for thinking about countries like India, or more broadly lower-income countries, is that today, it's just demographics, but over 80% of the world's women live in these lower-income countries. Let's see. So as I mentioned, we've seen a dramatic reduction in education gaps for gender, and I think in many countries the concerns now are about the reverse gender gap, about the fact that boys are falling behind in education at many levels. Yet where we don't see this translate, at least in lower-income countries, is when it comes into job opportunities. And I think increasingly there's been a lot more interest, and that's what I'm going to talk about, in thinking not about an individual's specific issues, but what may be the systemic barriers at the level of the society or economy that are holding them back. Now, a first view you might take is maybe still the best thing to do is to focus on growth. That you just look across the world and you see richer countries, there are more women working often in wage labor than in poorer countries. And one example of where you can think of getting some inspiration of this is the US. So if you look at either the black or the blue line, they're just differences in how the data series is constructed before the census had the information. What you see is as the US got richer, so as its GDP increased over time, we see the gender gap in labor force participation reduced. And so I've superimposed on this graph in green, India. And so what you could conclude from this is, India doesn't look great right now, but that's just because it's poorer. And it's to the left of the point at which its GDP is high enough that women enter the labor force in large numbers. So a little bit inspired by this question, and I'll talk a bit about it, we have at the Economic Growth Center a group of economists thinking about gender growth gaps. And so we put together labor force surveys, both that had already been harmonized, some more that we harmonized, to really look at this question in the context of today's lower middle income countries. So this is around 150 countries for which we have multiple data points. So if you just look at some of the main countries, again, the same thing, just ask what does the gender gap in labor force look against GDP, you find a very mixed pattern. So if you look at, in this one, if you look at, for instance, Brazil or Mexico, that looks like good news. You start, each of those dots in the same color would be the same country in different years. You do start seeing a decline in the gender growth gap. But if you look at India, if you even look at China, you look at South Africa, and you look at Indonesia, you really see no clear pattern. And this holds up when you look at this in a regression framework. So as I said, you can look at it across countries. So you can just ask the question of, do richer countries have a lower gender gap in labor markets? And you see that. But then if you ask the question in changes, so you ask that as the GDP grows, so as there are changes in GDP, do you see changes in the gender gap? And there, if you look at it with all the caveats that you can have on data series and cross-country regressions, you don't see any relationship, and in fact, some evidence that it is reversed. So if you look at the top panel, that's a typical cross-country regression, and you see some evidence that the gender growth gap in labor force participation or in employment or paid work reduces as you're a richer country. But then once you start running the same in changes, the only thing that remains of similar sign is the fact that there is marketization of the economy. So women will start working more for pay as the country gets richer, but you no longer see any robust relationship between labor force participation and growth. So I think this is sort of a first motivation to say that, maybe for some countries that we saw, like for Brazil and Mexico, growth has delivered returns for women, but there is no way we can take this for certain. And probably a lot of the reason that's going on is institutional or systemic barriers in these countries, which is what I turn to now. So let me start by giving you some examples of the two main sides that people have talked about. So this is a film called Mrs. in India that I think came out last year, which was an example of a woman who married into, a working woman who married into a very traditional household. Her problems and the fact that she just ended up leaving in the end rather than managing to change the system. So these are what we would think of, and I think a lot of discussion in the literature has been on such supply side and normative constraints. I think more recently there's also recognition that sometimes this affects demand side behavior. So for instance, Nina Bookman, who was a student here, thought about how this actually changes employers' willingness to hire women. And an example of this is, I think last year it made the news that the Apple supplier Foxconn was not hiring married women in India on the grounds that they would face significant normative constraints, or possibly because they were being paternalistic about it. So one could stop here and say that, this is it. We can do the research, but in terms of the bridging that Suhani talked about, maybe that's hard. But I'd say this is actually, I think right now, an opportunity as well, building on, I think, years of activism by many groups. We have begun to see significant policymaker interest in actually changing this. So, this is from a couple of years ago, and I think very much what Suhani was talking about in her report, there's a lot more interest, not just in thinking about flexible work or remote arrangements, but also recognition of, the so-called economic power that women have. And so what I want to do in the next 10 minutes is really give you some examples of, I think, where evidence can help sharpen what often is beginning to happen in policy, but perhaps is not happening in the most impactful or cost-effective way. And that I think is an important way in which we can build bridges right now, because there's certainly a lot of research going on in this area, and I think there's increasing policy interest both within countries and internationally. So let me start by kind of first talking about, I think, the different types of evidence that are possibly useful for policymakers. And I think this is certainly some place where researchers like I am often guilty, is that, we focus a lot on really trying to understand causal effects. But when you talk to policymakers, often that what changes attitudes or what is willing to push the needle on policy is really much more basic data. So I alluded to this earlier, but just as a 30-second advertisement, for the last few years at Yale, we've been bringing together people from both the macro and micro side to really think about what are the different types of evidence that can be useful. But before turning to that, let me just mention again just the two puzzles that we're going to be thinking about all of this in the context of. So the first one is for South Asia. In a lot of countries now, a lot of the discussion has been about the child penalty. So the idea that women enter the labor market, but when they have a child, they see a significant decline in their earnings after that. In South Asia, and this is from India, but this is true across other South Asian countries as well, the striking feature is there's less of a child penalty. It's rather that women are not entering the labor market. So what you see here, this is from the labor force surveys against age, just what activities they're doing. So you can see for age 18, the blue bar is the highest for both men and women. So most people are unmarried and studying. But then what you see is that for men, the pink area, orange-pink area expands, which is to be working and married. While for women, what expands is the yellow bar, which is to be married, but neither studying nor working. And you can see this very clearly in the data that women are getting educated at similar rates, they're not working, and when people therefore run kind of simple decompositional regressions, they're left with the conclusion that the main return to education for women is in the marriage market. And so then there's a lot of discussion about maybe that's good, maybe that's what you need to have children who are going to invest in human capital. But you can see from the perspective of women, it's a bit of an unending cycle. I have my daughter, she earns a lot, she gets educated a lot to then educate her daughter. So I think somewhere we need to start thinking about how you actually, think about the alternative, which is getting returns in the labor market. And that comes to this, is that when you look at labor force participation, in both urban and rural, but I think strikingly in urban areas, this is the flip. So this is labor force non-participation. So what you see is, this is true the world over, men work, right? Roughly 80-90% of the men work once they reach working age. But for women, we see very little to no gradient with education. If anything, in urban areas, women who have upper secondary education are slightly less likely to work than those with less education. So as I said, sort of what we've been doing at the Growth Center, and this is broader than just thinking about India or South Asia, is really to ask this question of, what are the different things that can help inform? So the first is really just thinking about basic metrics or indices. So there's work that was done by faculty, including those at Stanford, on thinking about how do you measure the growth effect of these distortions? What are the wedges it creates in the labor market? So some of my colleagues have been trying to construct this more broadly across different countries to really provide some basis, some numbers to the question of if you got women into the labor force, how much would productivity increase by? I've been colleagues working on this on the macro side, on the micro side, and then also trying to take this to policy forums and work with them on how they would operationalize it. And really the idea is that I think as researchers, we've often focused a lot on just very specific what policies work. But I think if you want to move the needle in terms of activity, you really need to also start thinking about what is that index that a policymaker can kind of shame countries on, or things that we don't love doing often, but I think are important if you really want to try to effect change here. So just to give you one example of this, I showed you some suggestive evidence of why growth isn't enough. But you can also, as I said, look at this in terms of just an index, and this is something that there's been a lot of work that has happened in economics. But very often what I think happens is we have an incredibly seminal paper that gets published on it. I think that's used a bit, but then less is done to really bring it all the way to policy. So what my colleagues have been doing have been trying to take the methodology of Sheikhley and Jones and actually try to ask how we can apply this across countries using labor force data. And the idea here is you're going to use observed differences in wages, labor supply, and sorting to ask what is the extent of misallocation you see. And I think this is distinct from some of the most used measures, at least at the World Bank right now, which come from looking at just legal barriers, either de jure or de facto, which are important. But this tries to tell you what's this effect on outcomes. So the first study they did was across Indian states, and I think that was actually featured in the World Development Report last year. And what they show is that if you just equalize the distortions across Indian states, and so you bring it down to the level of the lowest state, you will increase state-level productivity by up to 15%. And I think, I think this is hopefully the kind of number that one can use to try to create, say, some competition across Indian states to improve women in the labor market. So I'm sure I will soon run out of time, but let me just tell you what I'm hoping to do, and then we'll see how far I get. I want to talk a little bit about what we know on kind of constraints for women. But then I think when we think about policy, one insight you can get from academia is really what you want to think about is who are the gatekeepers and how do we actually affect their behavior. And that's some of the policy work I want to talk about. So in terms of what's happening, why do we see what's happening in women? So there was some earlier work by a couple of my colleagues, Michael Peters and Fabrizio, showing that India has had service-led growth. This service-led growth has been urban biased and has benefited those in urban areas more than rural areas. At the same time, what they noted in that but didn't pursue till now is that there is rapid urbanization. So in this paper, what they ask what are the gender differences in how urbanization, or rather how service-led growth affects men and women. And what they find is, urbanization is associated with women dropping out of the labor market, and so urban female labor force participation in India is significantly lower than rural. But then they also go beyond the fact of saying, oh, this is just an income effect, or, people are richer and so women are not working, to show that at least in the data, it looks like it's a combination of norms and discrimination. So both supply side and demand side factors that matter. So when you have that, one thing you could think about, and I think Sohani alluded to, and I will come back to this, I think, during the day, is that maybe we need to meet women where they are. And if they're in the house, we need to meet them often through digital tools. And this has been a focus across several countries and in many states in India to try to just increase access to smartphones. So we've seen several governments, several state governments say, let's have schemes where we just provide smartphones to women. So we studied one of these schemes in the state of Chhattisgarh, which was an early mover in this. And through a set of surveys and often the timing of whether we surveyed someone before or after rollout was randomized, what we found is very similar to, I think, what we found in the first wave of literature on microfinance, which is assets move or money moves within the household. So you can give a smartphone to a woman, but there's no reason it'll stick with her. It'll probably move to her son, it'll probably move to someone else. And so what we see out here is the first graph shows you that in the very short run, like 3 to 6 months after smartphones are provided, you do see women state that they're more likely to have smartphones. And then in the longer run, this completely disappears. The phones are no longer there. However, if at the time of providing the smartphone, you actually combine it with a training or ways to make women both feel that they can use the phone and how they hold on to it, we find that in those cases, not only do they have phones, they use them more. And perhaps in contrast to what we've seen in richer countries, it actually is positive on mental health. So the way you should think about it is a lot of these women are very isolated. They have moved at the time of marriage from one village to another. They've typically had their first child. Even if fertility has fallen, they'll have had their first child very soon after they've moved. They're at home with their husband's family that they don't know very well, and not much way to be in touch with, say, their natal household or others. And phones provide a link, not just for that, but phones also just provide entertainment. The number of women who'd say we just use it to watch things on YouTube is very high. And so I think there's a different way in which smartphones will work for this population, but it's not enough to just give phones. Otherwise, we're going to end up in the same place. I think we ended up a lot with microfinance. These are just, I think another example is when it comes to phones, is really thinking about the use case. So very often, if you think about the use case that rural households are seeing, it's still seeing an urban woman on a large screen using the phone apparently to do things that families don't want. But the last one, I think, was an example of why the training helped, right? So it's like, I don't know how to save contacts. I'll just give it to my son who knows how to do it. But if you train them enough to start getting used to it, I think that is valuable. The other thing we found in the short run, I think this was kind of a bit depressing, but a reminder for why you need this work, is we randomized whether we surveyed people before the woman got a phone or after. And what we found was that, that soon after getting the phone, norms around phone use actually became more conservative. Men started stating much more that they had more needs for the phone, which is consistent with now there being a valuable asset that you can get hold of if you actually argue it's meant for men. So I think, I'm going to be a bit fast now, so I want to talk a couple of other things, but I think, this just gives you an example of, I think, thinking about where the constraints are important in designing policies. So to not just think about, I need to give phones, but really asking what are the barriers, and these are all examples of papers that try to do that. So let me spend the last couple of minutes I have is to really talk about something that I know Lisa is going to pick up, among others, is really unintended consequences of policy interventions. I'm going to leave this as a teaser for Lisa's talk, which is the idea that, sometimes well-intended policies, like, for instance, maternity leave policies in India, could have negative impacts, which I'll leave for Lisa to tell us about. What I want to talk about for a second is, this fact that what we've seen over the last couple of years is an incredible expansion of unconditional cash transfers to women across Indian states. So you can see this, and I suspect the remaining states will get it as soon as their elections come around, is, this aim of targeting unconditional transfers to women, and very explicitly saying this is, some states very explicitly say this is because we don't see women working, we need to provide them support. And you can see there are two views, right? So there's one view to say that it gives women agency within the household. They're going to be able to negotiate for things, including whether they're able to leave the household. But it's unclear, because if there's another view to say that now you have some money by virtue of, you're richer, stay at home, look after children, can also strengthen normative constraints. And I think this is the kind of place where we really need research to start thinking about what is the net impact on women's work when we give out these kind of unconditional cash transfers. So I'm going to talk about very briefly one study that we did. I'm out of town, so I'll just say what we find is was actually not providing unconditional cash transfers, but strengthening women's ability to access pay that they should be getting under NREGA, which was going to joint household accounts, but now we ensure that it went to their own accounts. And when we did that, we found not only did their work go up, but importantly, we also found that their norms liberalized for women. And so they became more positive about working. We don't, however, see that men's norms liberalized, so I think that's something we need to change on. Similarly, just let me end with one more example. There's been a lot of interest in entrepreneurship. So there's this Lakhpati Didi scheme that is going on through self-help groups. But again, the question is, how do you target this? How do you target this effectively? Do you just give it out to every self-help group member, or should you give it more to some than others? Yeah, and here I think, again, there's findings that suggest that, one way of doing it is that at least some of it should be targeted towards women who have started to expand their businesses. So this is a very nice study by Gaurav Chiplangar and Penny Goldberg that show across the world, so each of this is Africa, East Asia, and so on, is they look at the ratio between male and female employees, and they find that basically if you are owned by a woman, you're just much more likely to have female managers. A bit more likely to have female workers, a lot more likely to have female managers. So if women hire women, and that is productive, they show their productivity gains, then with these kind of schemes, at least some of it should perhaps be a bit more targeted. So let me just end with just saying that I think, very much building what Suhani was saying, I think we want to start thinking a lot more about how we integrate these into policies and corporate strategies. And I think for us as researchers, what's very valuable to hear what policies and corporations are trying to do. We don't hear enough about that. I think forums like these are others are important so that, out of the 1,000 questions we can answer, we answer the ones that speak to what's actually happening on the ground. And so let me just end with, I think, some of these questions that will probably come up during the day, but are I think, questions that I think different parts of both the policy community, research community, and the private sector are thinking about, but perhaps more connections there would be useful. So thank you very much.
In one of your graphs in the earlier stage where you were basically showing different countries and how the gender gap and the GDP were interrelated, among the lower income countries, India was still showing pretty high on the gender gap, and this is like Mexico, South Africa. And so does that tend to communicate that it's not actually about the money, but more about the behaviorals and normative patterns and societal patterns, which are actually a differentiator?
Yeah, I mean, what it certainly tells us is that it's not as if as countries get richer, opportunities for women will rise and women will take them up. Now, where exactly those institutional barriers come in, whether they come in on the supply side or on the demand side, and how they differently show up across countries, I think is exactly where we need to go. But I think what I wanted to do is kind of move us away from this view that we don't need to do anything other than just focus on growth. And I think there's often, especially right now, when there are downturns or there are concerns, there's often you hear this claim that then not enough jobs anyway. So what we need to do is first just expand growth and expand jobs, and then women will get them as well. I think we have no evidence to see that's the pattern in the data.
Thanks. Yeah, and richer households actually are shown in India also to not have working women, which goes, thanks.
My name is Shreya, and I'm a graduate student at the law school. This is such interesting work. Thank you so much for sharing it. I was thinking how much of it is because of this psyche of a woman, not just in the lower sections of the society, but also like middle class and upper middle class women in India. I think there's some sort of, if I may say, complacency that develops over not working for a few years, and then they decide that, okay, maybe we don't want to work now that we're in a comfortable environment. I mean, I'm playing the devil's advocate, I get it. But I'm just trying to understand how much of work also needs to come from women in order to get into the workforce.
So I think, what you're saying, economists will call the income effect, that, basically as a household, I get richer and maybe I opt out because now leisure is more valuable, or I have more advantage of doing housework compared to my partner, and so I'm the one who stays home. I think that's certainly a possibility. It's not what we see often in surveys. So what you see in surveys very often, I think both among younger and older populations, a desire to work. And I think, interestingly, a lot of what you also see in surveys is statements of boredom. So I think, I think it's a perfectly, I think what you're asking is a very reasonable explanation, and one that economists would agree with, but it may be going on for some, but we also see a lot of women who want to work but aren't able to get work.